Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. I'm Alistair Chariton, your host this week. Our main topic is smarter sourcing, stronger partnerships, and agile inventory. And before we discuss that topic, we'll pick up on a recent news article. As always, we invite you to take part in the chat. So if you're registered and joining on Business Reporter, the chat box is on your screens. Do take part, and we will welcome your questions and insights and experiences. And the contribution we find most valuable will, as always, be receiving a Supply Chain Talk mug. So let me introduce my two guests, and the first of these is Tom Bernth, who's a director for global supply chain at Southworth International Group, who are a US manufacturer of hydraulics equipment for materials handling in warehouses and the like. Tom lives north of Boston in New England, and he spent the past 20 years in international and domestic supply chain, working mostly in manufacturing and also in procurement. His earlier employers all owned factories in at least 3 countries outside the US, and they had strong and widened international supply chains and leveraged intercompany transfer of manufactured goods to gain economies of scale. So I know Tom will have some interesting insights on tariffs, and lately US tariffs have been keeping Tom very busy.
Very busy.
In his much younger 20s, Tom was a maintenance technician, and then he managed maintenance in manufacturing. And later in business, he had the opportunity to audit larger companies for quality and efficiency in manufacturing. And in his spare time, Tom enjoys bass fishing and gardening with his wife, Michelle. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
And my second guest is Dr. Derek Westfall, who is president of Westfall Consulting Group. Derek has over 35 years of supply chain experience, and he retired from the Boeing company in 2022. And he's currently a supply chain faculty member at both Oregon State University and Portland State University. And a fun fact about Derek is that he once bought Wayne Gretzky a beer, and Derek did explain to us yesterday that Wayne Gretzky is not just a Canadian ice hockey player, but he's considered the greatest ice hockey player ever. So that is a real experience to have met him and bought him a beer. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you.
So our news item this week is from The Economist. It was published on April 28th, so just a week or two ago. And it's headed up "The Trouble with MAGA's Manufacturing Dream," i.e. the trouble with the Make America Great Again dream. And it's subheaded, "Donald Trump underestimates the difficulty of producing in America and how his own policies will make it harder." So I would recommend the article. I mean, the articles we pick, we always try to make them interesting, but The Economist does write very well, and it really summarizes a lot of very interesting issues. So as we all know, tariffs, well, supposedly are to encourage manufacturers to bring manufacturing back to the US. This article talks about the fact that the shift of factories to America will be a lot harder than the administration expects, and its policies will make it harder still. So just to run through some of the key points it makes, first of all, it says there's a real labor supply problem. Obviously, production worker pay in America is higher than overseas, twice as much as the level in China, and nearly 6 times as much as Vietnamese workers get paid. But those wages are not attracting enough people into manufacturing in the US, and there's a real shortage, and there's particularly a shortage of skilled workers. The second thing is that automation, which we might think would be moving along pretty fast in the US, given the labor cost pressures there, in fact, automation is really lagging in America. There's a chart which shows the number of industrial robots per 10,000 workers in manufacturing, and the US is at 295 robots per 10,000 workers, whereas China is almost twice that at 470, and South Korea is at over 1,000 robots per 10,000 workers, so 3-4 times as many as in the US. Next thing is for manufacturers thinking of going back to the US. Well, they're going to have to build factories or extend factories, but there's huge difficulties in building factories, the article says. There's a real troubled state of construction in America, with shortages of labor, planning delays, all sorts of things like that. So again, a real problem there. And finally, even if you manage to build a factory, there's inadequate infrastructure, particularly the electricity grid, which is decades and decades old, and there can be delays of many years to connect a new factory to the grid. So again, a huge problem there. And finally, in terms of Donald Trump's policies, well, clamping down on immigration is going to make it even harder to get labor into factories because the jobs seem to be unattractive, and so that will worsen things. And also the uncertainty, the constant flip-flopping on what's happening, what isn't happening, is making it hugely difficult for companies to make any sort of decision. So a lot of things there summarizing how many factors are making the fact that there'll be a lot of time and cost to move production back. And turning to you, Tom, do you think the article is a fair summary of the situation, or are there some really important positives that the article doesn't cover?
I think that it understates the difference in comparing China to the United States. For example, in skilled labor in China, the workers are paid somewhere between 25 to 35 renminbi, maybe 40 renminbi at a max, which
Mm,
really is between $5 and $6 an hour. And
right.
when you compare that to the cost of labor in America, of course it just dwarfs it. Next,
Mm,
you've also got what they didn't mention at all is overhead. And everybody mentions material costs and they mention labor. They didn't mention overhead, which is also much less expensive in China.
mm,
And so the cost comparison is just very difficult. You have to know your total cost of ownership as you're considering, do I build in America or do I stay in China? Um, if you're going to build in America, even in good terms, and in good times where there's no influx in the economy, you're looking at least 4 years before you're able to really produce a factory which is efficient. I mean, you've just
mm,
got the engineering and the planning and financing within your own corporate organization, but then you have
mm,
to get your financing from your banking. You have to find a location, but probably two or three locations to find the best one. It just takes a lot before you're really, you can't just open next week or
yeah.
make movements next week to do that. And you have lead times waiting for machinery to get your people hired, but then you also have the training aspect, which
Mm.
takes a long time before you can actually compete in the US market compared to your very efficient factory you've left overseas.
So if anything, you're saying the article kind of is being almost being kind, and in fact the situation's
Yeah.
almost worse than portrayed. No, thank you, Tom. Derek, what are your thoughts on how difficult and time consuming it will, the amount of time needed to bring manufacturing back to the US?
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything Tom just said. That the I mean, this is like I said before we started this show, Al. So we could have a whole show on just this article, right? Because
Yeah.
there's so much there, and all the stuff that you listed in the description. But
Mm.
to me, as a college professor, what I see is there's nobody wants these jobs. And first day of class,
Mm.
I raised my hand. I said, "Who wants to make $100,000 a year in supply chain?" All the hands go up. I said, that's perfect because we need 80,000 truck drivers here in the United States. And that's where I could get you to have that job. Then all the hands come down. Nobody wants those jobs. So if they don't want to make $100,000 being a truck driver, uh, and we also have the same problem finding warehouse folks to work in warehouses that only
Mm.
pay $20 an hour. Nobody wants those jobs. And
Mm.
so where are we going to find these workers, right? There's nobody to stock these factories. Nobody wants these blue collar jobs. And I don't know. I mean, again, when I was in high school a long time ago, you took shop and it got you ready for something other than college. And so you can make a good middle class wage or living
Mm.
doing something like that. But now nobody wants those blue collar jobs.
Yeah, that's really interesting because also it's sort of because I mean, an option for a few companies, not many, is that they already have factories. They could set up a second shift or a third shift and really run
Mhm.
that factory harder, and they don't
Yep.
have building delays. But those jobs are even less attractive because they're unsocial hours and so on. So
Yep.
that one. But just sort of perhaps going around again, turning to the question of productivity. I mean, why do you think that the US isn't really pushing hard on getting automation and robotics in? Because as we've recognized that the cost of labor is much higher and all the overhead there, the difficulty getting labor is difficult as well. You can't find the labor. And so surely, if Korea can have 3, 4 times as many robots, how come the US isn't just kind of investing in, Tom, what are your thoughts on that one?
I just went to a show in Chicago called ProMat
Mhm.
6 weeks ago. And I was surprised at the show. I mean, it's all robots. That's 90% of all the booths there were all robots.
Right. Mm.
But in my conversations with other suppliers, they're very much getting into robotic welding and some robotic um, manufacturing, but moving material in the warehouses. They have AGVs, but really getting fully robotic is just we're just holding back on that, and I'm not sure why.
Mm.
I wanted
Mm.
to add to one other comment that Derek made, and is just trying to find these folks again. There's nobody here that wants to screw those little screws in the iPhones. Or to make, do we want to make dolls or Hasbro games in the United States? Of course, you're never going to
Mm.
find workers that
Mm.
want to do that.
Yeah, yeah, which is all the more important why kind of robots, for some of these repetitive tasks, robots you'd think would be perfect and the payback would
Yep.
be rapid. It's interesting, isn't it? Derek, what are your thoughts on the robotics question?
Yeah, I think if I think about this logically, I would think that the U.S. factories, like you alluded to earlier, are older. The factories in China and South Korea are newer, relatively newer. And so I think it facilitates that automation better. I think that they were thoughtful in the way they designed their factories that would make it easier to implement those types
Mm.
of things. The other thing when I talk to people in the industry is they're just scared to make that investment, right? They don't really understand what the robots can do or what they need to do, or they're looking
Mm.
for this next best thing. They have this fear of if I buy today, then 6 months later I should have bought this other thing that's twice as more efficient, faster, and so
Mm.
there's this temptation to jump into the game, right? And so I think that's what I see out there.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, you kind of thinking, should the administration in the US be encouraging and putting incentives and grants for people to invest in robotics which would be a good lever to increase production. Yeah.
Adding to that also,
Yeah.
when we have uncertainty like this in the economy, people are waiting and watching until
Mm.
things are changing, yesterday and today with the tariffs. But while
Mm.
there's uncertainty in the economy, people don't want to drop CapEx into their budget.
Yeah, yeah, I know that uncertainty is a big factor. I'm sure everyone in the audience, we've all been there, and we can all plan and cope with a change, but if it just keeps changing, we've got one lot of plans together, and then suddenly everything's changed again. It's impossible to run supply chains and optimize them like that. Great. Well, that's as I say, an interesting article. Let's move to our main topic, which, as a reminder, smarter sourcing, stronger partnerships, and agile inventory. And the first discussion point on the agenda is diversing and expanding supplier networks to enhance competitiveness and reliability. And I guess, we've talked in the article about bringing your supply back to the US, but of course the alternative is to move away from the really high tariff countries to, a 10% tariff country for the sake of argument. And I guess, I don't know, Tom and Derek, if you'd agree, but I think finding new suppliers is relatively straightforward, not easy, but it's straightforward for standard products. But how do you do this for more specialist items? That's always the sort of the challenge. It takes time and so on. Tom, what are your thoughts on that?
So with the specialized items, you have to really have establish the relationships that you're in it with the supplier. You have to
Mm.
define expectations. And I'm in Turkey right now, actually doing this right now, where we're meeting with new suppliers to bridge the gaps and to further dual source our supply chain so that we not only are augmenting our supply chain that we have in China, but also we're establishing a second supply chain here in Turkey where we know that the tariffs are low. We know that the tariffs are lower and that there's a balanced trade. You also have to know your numbers. What's the cost of steel compared to the United States?
Mm.
Mexico is 10% less. Northern Europe is 33% less. Turkey is 44% less, and China is 58% less than America. When you combine those costs of steel and raw materials with the obvious differences in labor costs, you can see how
Mm.
China checks all the boxes. But really looking at this, all the tariffs are really forcing us to do is just to look to other countries.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I mean, so what you're saying is that these gaps between the US is it just on materials, labor, overhead, everything. It's just such an enormous gap that kind of a 20% tariff, a 40% tariff, it still ain't going to cut it. You're still going to be sourcing overseas. It's just a question of where. That's a very interesting insight. And Derek, what are your thoughts on how do you find suppliers and how do you develop a supplier for a more specialist product?
Yeah, I think again, Tom's spot on with his analysis and his description. But I'm gonna take a little bit further and say that I come from Boeing. That's where I spent my last part of my career, right? So we have some very specialized stuff, uh, parts and very tight tolerances, those types of things. And to go out and find a new supplier, yes, relatively safe. Go find another supplier that can do this stuff, right? But the cost of doing that is so expensive because you got to have new tooling, you got to find a supplier with the capability, you got to develop the relationships so that they can get the drawings and the specs that you can even share with them based on some ITAR regulations, those types of things. And so then there's those types of issues that you have to deal with. But the biggest problem that happens when you dual source a new supplier is there's always quality issues. And how do you rectify those overseas, those types of things? And then there's always delivery issues starting out because you're basing your production on this part coming in on this particular day, and if it doesn't happen, now all of a sudden you have literally a whole airplane sitting there on the factory floor waiting for this part that maybe got scrapped back at the suppliers, and now it just causes mass confusion throughout the whole supply chain, right? And so the concept of finding a new supplier, well, just go find a new supplier. Okay, that's fairly straightforward, but all the back end stuff of tooling, designing, engineering, all that stuff, that all takes time. And especially if you're trying to find somebody new, you're doing stuff by word of mouth, you're looking on the internet, and so or go visiting. But to really understand their capabilities, you have to get like a first article or some part from them to really see what their capabilities are. And it's very, all that stuff takes time. First of all, it takes a huge amount of time, and then it's very expensive.
Yes, that's interesting. And I think what you're alluding to there as well is the huge cost of getting a supplier up and
Yes,
running, because you're going to
100%.
be, duplicating,
Yep,
molding, design,
yep,
all sorts of things
yep.
like that. So I guess the question there is when you have a more customized product, a specialist product, rather than a commodity that's just generally available to everyone,
Mhm.
you're going to really lose volume economics. Is, like with Tom, you're talking about saying, well, you're going to have Chinese suppliers and Turkish suppliers, and you sort of be implying you're going to have some backup there. So isn't there a risk that you're going to kind of be, spreading the same volume across two suppliers, and you're going to be paying more as well? How do you get that balance of resilience and backup versus having to pay more for all your product?
So if you're going to have a dual source or a backup on your supply chain, you
Mm,
really have to acknowledge to yourself that that's going to cost me some money. It's not
mm,
always going to be the same price as it is in China.
mm.
So if you establish the balance up front and you define with your supplier with a clear forecast, this is what you're going to make for me. And in fact, this is what you're going to make for me if the tariffs are controllable like they are as of yesterday.
Yeah.
Then in the same token, you also have to let them know that if things all of a sudden turn for the worse, there's an embargo or the tariff comes back or something like that, that they have to be prepared and have the capacity to jump in and and step up and fill that capacity for you. And adding to what Derek said before, you also have to really evaluate your supplier's supply chain itself. Can they
Mm,
keep up?
mm.
And with first article inspections, this is exactly what we do, just to make sure that we're testing our suppliers so that we can see and we help them to reduce their costs so that they're more efficient and more reliable. It's all about
Yeah.
partnership.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Derek, I mean, what's been your experience? I mean, at Boeing, and indeed, with
Yeah,
your consulting experience of how you manage that, especially if you're going from, I suppose, having just one supplier to then saying, oh, things are getting a little bit sort of,
yeah,
there's too many risks out there. We better build. I mean, do
yeah,
do 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 sort of the management, do the
yeah.
directors
And
accept that they just have to pay a bit more for materials?
I think that leads into the bigger picture of we've all grown up in this world of just in time and single source to keep your costs down,
Mm,
all this stuff, right?
mm,
And we've been down this road, right, with the pandemic and all this stuff. So now the question becomes what's next, right? Well, it's always comes back to inventory and how do what's the right amount of inventory and the cost and everything. But if you were my single source supplier, you, Alistair, my single source supplier, you know how much my volume is, you know all the stuff, so we keep the cost low. I know exactly what to expect. But if I go dual source, there's not going to be a supplier that says, "Oh, I'm happy with you taking 30% of the business, trying to keep the cost down." So that let's not kid ourselves and think that that's doable. So understand that if we're going to diversify our supply base and have more suppliers, dual source, multi source, whatever, your unit cost is going to increase regardless, because there's nobody, no supplier is going to say, "Oh yeah, we'll give you the same price." That's not
Yeah.
a problem. And
Yeah.
so it's not going to happen. So uh, this goes in that bigger discussion of how do we design our supply chain not to be as efficient. I mean, we want it to be efficient, of course, but how do we make it more resilient? And that was never talked about prior to 2019 or 2020. And
Yes.
so now that's the question, right? So companies have to swallow the pill and say, look, we can't rely on a single source anymore. We understand that, but we have to dual source or multi-source, and just understand that there's a huge price to pay for that strategy.
Yeah.
It's not cheap.
Okay. In fact, this is a good time. It leads very nicely as a quick reminder to our audience that in 4 weeks' time, on June the 3rd, we have the Supply Chain Risk and Resilience Summit in London, our one-day conference organised by Business Reporter. I think there's genuinely just a few places left. So for anyone who is able to get to London on June the 3rd, that topic and many others, I'm sure, will be discussed with a lot of great speakers there. So have a look on the website for that. Great, thanks. Let's move to our second discussion point, which is exploring new sourcing models to balance cost, speed, and sustainability. And I guess, ideally a supplier can deliver rapidly in any quantity, but manufacturing time, transport time, and sourcing the supplier's raw materials can make for very long lead times. So what are some of the options to get a sort of better speed without high cost or high risk for the supplier? Because I guess you can insist to a supplier to just say, you've got to have 3 months of my product sitting there, finished product, but that's a high cost, which ultimately the supplier or you will bear. But are there ways you can get a better balance there? Turning to you, Tom.
Yeah, I think that if you work with your suppliers, and if you define your expectations in a master frame agreement or a purchase agreement, that's the first place to start. Have an accurate forecast and live with the forecast. And then in your purchasing transactions, you would try to get to blanket POs, so that for example, if you have a 3-month lead time on typical parts, that you're reaching out 6 months, where you have a reasonable good idea what the demand is going to be, and you have blanket POs that are already out there, so the supplier is hopefully staying ahead of you. Then if you do need to pull something in, the supplier will work with you, because they're looking for that revenue also. They'll be able to push it in and support you. But again, it's all about working with the supplier, encouraging them to stock more.
Yes.
Stocking agreements are also a positive way to do it, so that they're not worried about the risk if you decide you're going to upgrade your model and all of a sudden they have obsolete parts.
Okay, so you sometimes will give that assurance to suppliers to say, you're owning this product, but these materials, but if actually, we suddenly say we don't need them anymore, we'll bail you out, we'll pay for them, kind of thing. Yeah, yeah. Derek, what are your thoughts on some of the options to manage that balance of sourcing, speed, cost, and sustainability?
Yeah, I think manufacturers they need to come to the realization that suppliers are business partners. They're there to make money as well. And just like some of the stuff that Tom mentioned, guaranteeing that if you have stuff in stock, I'll buy it at a certain amount of time. If it's obsolete, we go from model A to model B. I got the other inventory. And really, it's about treating your business partners how you want to be treated. We got to get away from this beating up the suppliers, threatening the suppliers, and pounding the suppliers into submission. That's not a good way of doing business, and it's not really sustainable, because you're not going to find people or companies that want to do business with you when you operate like that. And it's a little bit of a digression, but and not really manufacturing, but if you turn back, look at what Walmart did back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, when they just used to pound their suppliers for cost, right? But then Walmart grew so much that all of a sudden Walmart was their biggest customer. And so Walmart's got them in a corner, basically. And it's either you do business the way we want you to do business, which was give us the lowest cost, but they're losing money on half their business. And so but a lot of people adopted that model, right? And they just beat up their supplier and they'll just go find somebody else. Well, that model is not sustainable because people aren't going to want to do business with people that think that way or act that way, or this is how we do business. If you want my business, this is how it's going to be. That those days are gone, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, it's interesting just sort of thinking on that topic. Have you got, I mean, obviously, I'm not expecting you to share anything which is confidential, but
Yeah.
have you got any comments on how suppliers have dealt with tariffs? Because I mean, I'm hearing as well from some people that some suppliers are saying, or rather some customers are saying to their supplier, tough, I'm not paying a tariff, kind of, which is, depending on
Mhm.
their contracts, I suppose they might be able to say that. Others are
Yeah.
saying, sure, the tariff, I'll have to pay it. I'm just curious to know, Tom, what can you share on anything on that?
I can share this, that we received two different kinds of letters. The first letter is that there's going to be a tariff surcharge. And the benefit
Mm,
of a surcharge is it goes away if the tariff goes away.
yeah.
Or there's going to be a price increase of 7 or 8% or 10% to cover the cost of the tariff. Those tend to never go away.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so which way do we want to do it? But, you know, our suppliers are doing, our suppliers are, they're trying to protect their business with us as a customer as well. But I
Mm,
think that, when we're looking with our suppliers, adding to what Derek said earlier, is that the transaction is really simple, that we ask our suppliers to deliver on time with a quality product, and we
mm.
should pay them on time. And I remember before COVID squeezing the heck out of my suppliers for 60 and 90 days payment terms, which we never do anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that we've learned some lessons, valuable lessons with COVID.
Yes, yeah. And Derek, have you sort of come across what's going on in the market, in terms of how suppliers and customers are kind of dealing with the tariff cost?
No, in fact, Tom just opened my eyes to an interesting concept of the surcharge, right? When the tariff
Mm,
goes away, the surcharge goes away. I think that's the way to do it. But I specifically have not spoken with any clients about the tariffs. I
yeah.
have to admit that that's not my strong suit.
No, 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 that's fine. But it's interesting, Tom, what you're saying is that really, either way, the cost of that tariff is going to come into the US,
Oh yeah,
and it's
no
going to be
doubt.
passed on to the customer, whether a business customer or a consumer. So
We're all
ultimately,
watching it. And what I also found very interesting is that, if you go to Sweden, if you go to Germany, I'm in Turkey right now, these people are really in tuned on the news in the United States.
mm,
And they're
mm,
very much aware of what the largest economy is doing, and what President Trump is doing and the administration is doing. It's really, it's a global economy now, and
mm.
there's a very strong awareness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good. Let's move to our third point, which is using dynamic inventory management to optimize stock levels and reduce disruptions. It sort of feels that this is sort of just getting into S&OP and forecasting. So kind of how do you get that balance of stock versus disrupted availability? And I'm so particularly, I suppose I wonder, Tom, you can perhaps comment on where you are now and previous experiences. You know, does the procurement function have clear enough objectives? We often hear, and especially in the old days, of procurement just bought at the lowest cost. Oh yeah, sorry, here you got a container load which is 12 months of stock, but there you go, I got it cheap. And the fact that 20% of it will be made obsolete, that's not my problem. I've met my objectives. I mean, how well do you think procurement functions these days? Are set realistic objectives? Do the board, do finance understand the balances to find?
Every Friday at 11 a.m. is kind of one of my stressful moments, where we have what we call the SIOPS meeting, sales, inventory, and ops.
Right.
And of course, there's always the forecasting, and forecasting is never accurate enough because it can't be. It's just that crystal ball thing that we try to manage. But if you have a very stable month to month revenue stream, then
Mm,
your supply chain is pretty much flat also. But if you have ebbs and flows, then you have
mm,
to try to anticipate. We've always taken the belief that it's better to ship on time than to have a little bit of excess inventory. So we do have a uh, a safety stock, which kind of reflects if we do have some positive ebbs and flows in the inventory in the business, that we can support it.
mm,
But it goes to your last question earlier about working with your suppliers on having their inventory ready for you. So
mm.
if you do have something, that's great news that shows up with a nice big order, that you can support it.
Yeah, yeah. And Derek, what are your thoughts on how well companies understand getting this balance, with their inventory at suppliers, in their own warehouses and so on?
Yeah, I think from supply chain standpoint, from the supply chain professional standpoint, especially from the purchasing standpoint, they understand it very well. Like they get the game because they're the ones that get charged with why do you have so much inventory? They have to answer those questions. Why didn't your suppliers deliver on time? They get to answer those questions. And for the last 5 years, they've been beat up with these questions, right? And they understand it very, very well. The problem is the folks above them, the C-suite folks, president, vice presidents, finance,
Mm.
and marketing, and eventually the CEO, don't quite fully grasp it yet. Like why are all these costs escalating? Why is this going on? It's like, well, inventory costs more because we have to carry more for all these various reasons.
Yeah.
And so that old day of just getting the best price and those types of those days, come on, those days are over. Those days have been over for a long time.
Mm.
And so there's this shift in thinking, right? But again, you got people that have been in business for 30, 40 years, and they were very successful and have been very successful up to the last 5 years, and it's not caught up to them. But the supply chain folks, I'm convinced, fully understand that I'm not about cost anymore. I'm about managing risk. I'm about managing, uh, anticipating downfalls, pitfalls, trying to beef up my supply chain wherever I can. And if I can dual
Mm.
source or multi-source, then I'll do it. But understand there's a cost to this. And so you have to be very good at explaining and providing data and information to the higher ups of why we're going to make these decisions or why we're making these decisions or why we're going down this road. Otherwise, people don't understand. And
Yeah.
so that's what I see out there, and that's what I
Mm.
feel. Tom may have a different opinion of that, but as a supply chain folks, I think we get it because we're the ones that have to manage the risk and mitigate the risk, and we're the ones that get blamed if this, that, and the other thing happens. It's like, well, wait a second. Before it was like this, now today's game is like this.
Yeah.
I think that Rebecca in the chat room actually brings up a great point about your ERP systems, where your ERPs are typically looking back 6 months or something like that, or a year possibly. And most people have dialed
Mm.
it back to 6 months so that we're more recent with our ERP systems. But as you have your demand or your revenue stream moving up or down, it's hard to forecast what's going on in the future. So, staying ahead of is the trick. And when we're working with our sales team, we try to eliminate those silos and just communicate as much as we can. We encourage our sales team to take a chance. And, we say, the rule is, you're not going to be punished if this order falls off the radar, or if it goes to the next quarter, but at least we'll be prepared. And
Mm.
so you not only have to look back that 6 months on your ERP system or your MRP, you also have to look forward and really embrace your sales team and their ability to forecast.
Yeah, and actually picking up on Rebecca's question, which essentially is saying that demand forecasting, does, the basis of demand forecasting is looking at past history. Is what can it do except look at past history and use all sorts of clever algorithms and mathematics to make the best forecast from that. And my experience, you're often looking 2-3 years back to look at seasonality and things like that. But as Rebecca says, with all the different changes that have been lately, tariffs suddenly would distort hugely, and obviously COVID and all the other things we've seen. So, are there ways that companies are coping with that? Derek, what's your experience there? I mean, obviously you're teaching as well, so I'm sure you see
Yeah.
what's going on.
And so one of the first concepts we talk about when we talk about forecasting is, up until, again, keep going back to pandemic, but up until pandemic, things were nice and smooth and steady, and you had
Mm.
these
Mm.
what we call outliers, right? So now there are black swan events, and the spike in demand was because of this, or the lack of demand was because of this, and these we call them these black swan events, right? Well, black swan events are every day now. I mean, they're common. I mean, we can sit here and rattle off all the stuff that's even happened just this year, right? And so what you still do, the formulas still are the same, but now you have to be more deliberate on your attempt to understand what the data is telling you and understand that, oh, there was this spike in demand or there was this lack in demand, and
Mm.
what was correlating, what was going on in the world at this time to cause that, right? And so
Mm.
then you have to manipulate the data. You can't just rely on the mathematical. This is where you add your quantitative or your qualitative information to that forecast to say, oh, there was this event that happened, so we're going to adjust the forecast 10% or 15% or whatever, whichever way you needed it to adjust it to account for those events. And so the math still works, but you now get to add your qualitative information to it to go in and say, but this happened, so we're going to adjust it back down to this, or adjust it to this, or whatever you're going to do.
Yeah, yeah. And Tom, have you sort of been dealing with that kind of
Adding to what
all
Derek
historical
said,
data is so
adding to
different
what Derek
now.
said, you know, we'd never say thank God for the pandemic, but it was like a training class for us. And it was really a class in risk management on how we get through unusual situations. And so that really prepared us for what's going on today, like with the tariff situation. And this is a global thing that's going on. You know, we have to be agile, we have to be aware, we have to be in the data, and we have to be communicating regularly with our suppliers so that they know what's going on. You know, there's nothing wrong with, you know, talking to your suppliers and saying, how are you doing on your raw materials? How is this supplier doing? And you know, if you're looking at building a machine or building an aircraft, like Derek was working before, just that one little limit switch, if it's not there, the machine or the product does not ship. That $20 part will stop $1 million thing from shipping.
Yep.
And so we have to be on all of it.
Yeah, and I think I must say that's a really interesting point that Derek's made from his experience with Boeing and you're making that as well, Tom. And that is that I think sometimes, you know, senior management, C-suite, maybe they can be quite blunt in some of their direction of saying, no, you've got to keep inventory lower. Well, actually, if there's a $20 part that's kind of needed in every one of your aircraft, just have 6 months stock of it, for God's sake. Never ever risk running out. Whereas if it's a kind of like a $50 million, $10 million jet engine, sure, you're not going to have a few of those knocking around in case one has got a problem when it's attached to the wing. You know, those ones you're going to deliver as demanded. But I think it's sort of sometimes, you know, kind of direction and policies can be perhaps a little bit.
But as leaders in our organization, we also have to communicate not only with the suppliers, but with our own executive management team so that they know where the costs are. They know what the lead times are, so they know what to expect. You know, you've got to have those monthly business reviews and have those conversations and get your supply chain slides in that slide deck so that the organization knows what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Well, that kind of actually brings us almost to the end of the show. So the happy task of the Supply Chain Talk mug. I think, Rebecca, great questions, great extra discussion. So a mug will be on its way to you. Our next episode is on June the 11th at 4 p.m, same time, British Summer Time. And the subject is blockchain in supply chains. Trends, progression, and potential. So that's going to be a really fascinating one because I think we haven't talked about blockchain for a little while, and I must say it'll be fascinating to see the views whether it is actually really happening in a big way or is still kind of yet to roll out big time. So that's going to be an interesting one. Thank you again to my guests, Tom Bernth, Director Global Supply Chain at Southworth International Group, and to Dr. Derek Westfall, President at Westfall Consulting Group. You've been great guests, made some great contributions there. Thank you for the audience, and do join us next time on June the 11th. So goodbye.
Thank you.